Are you ready to hear a story that will give you goosebumps? If you are, hit that like button to boost your courage, share to warn your friends, and subscribe to our channel so you won't miss any chilling tales from us. Now then, let the story begin. So, I've got a bunch of family coming in for Halloween. In our tradition, we usually have a small party of close family and friends, hang out and watch old scary movies over a potluck of amazing food. Not everyone has arrived yet, of course, but we had dinner with everyone who's already made it here last night. We got on the topic of scary stories, and my family members had a surprising number of them. I'd like to preface this by saying I am an atheist and a scientist, not prone to belief in paranormal nonsense. However, I've had some experiences which I can't explain that have led me to have an open mind towards others, even if I know science doesn't support their claims. Every scientist must accept that there are some things we don't yet understand. On top of that, many of my family members are very old-fashioned. In their traditions, certain things just weren't spoken about. Strange sights, abilities, happenings. It just wasn't done to discuss them freely, but this is 2016, and I've managed to wheedle out some of the most interesting, creepy stories I've ever heard. Some of my family, I'm sure, is exaggerating for dramatic effect, but there are many who I know are 100% trustworthy and not creative enough to come up with tales like this. There is also physical proof that I've seen in some cases. I will only be posting what I feel are the creepiest and most genuine accounts. That being said, the first story was told by my mother. This particular story is absolutely true. Not only has her account of events never changed, my mother is as serious and secular as I am. I'm positive this is not the type of thing she'd lie about. My mother, Leanne, was something of the black sheep in her family. Being the eldest of 5 siblings and my grandmother being a single mother meant that my mom had a lot of responsibility thrust on her at a very young age. She went through a rebellious stage, moving across the country with her fiancé against the family's wishes. This took place in 1991, 1 year before I was born. My mother moved to Tennessee with her fiancé Keith. Keith was a painter and worked in construction, and my mother struggled to find a job in a completely new place, cut off from family and friends. They didn't have very much money, so when looking for a place to live, they had to settle for what they could get. The house was in an average neighborhood and wasn't very impressive. It was 2 stories with 2 bedrooms upstairs, but the place had been mid-renovation. Keith had agreed to fix up the house in exchange for lower rent. My mother told me that the first time she noticed something strange was the very first time they pulled up in the driveway. Keith was showing her the house to make sure she liked it before finalizing the paperwork. When he parked the car, my mother saw a girl in the window upstairs, staring at them through a gap in the curtains. The girl had brown hair and was wearing white, but my mother couldn't see more than that. She turned and asked, "Are the owners here to show us around?" Keith had laughed. "Show us around what? It's a small house." When she tried to point out the girl to Keith, there was nothing there at all. Keith, of course, thought she was only trying to scare him. My mother, being a realist and non-superstitious, believed it must have been a trick of the light. They eventually agreed to rent the place and moved in. This is where the real creepiness begins. There were a few small things they noticed at first. Sometimes early in the morning, the kitchen would smell strongly of bacon and coffee, as though someone had just finished cooking. Sometimes a door would swing shut, but they believed this to be because the house was rather old and drafty. The smaller of the 2 bedrooms upstairs my mother referred to as the cold room because it was always freezing, even though it was frequently unused and had the windows closed and locked. This is the room that my mother thought she had seen a girl standing in when they first arrived. There was a small door to a crawl space with an old-fashioned crystal knob that had been painted over and would not open. Finally, there was a section of the wall upstairs that was missing as part of the renovations. It instead had a thick piece of plywood cut to fit the gap and sealed up tight. The plywood set into the gap in wall continually fell out. Keith duct taped the edges and it still fell out. They pressed heavy boxes up against it and it still fell out. You could hear it drop heavily from downstairs, and my mother said this quickly moved from annoying to disturbing. Beyond the plywood was a gap in the space between the walls with nothing but wiring, but big enough to be a small closet. My mom said it was too dark to see much, and they just fixed the plywood back in place each time it fell. Within weeks of moving there, the 2 of them began fixing up the place. One day, my mother was cleaning the downstairs bathroom, on her knees scrubbing the tub, while Keith was outside working. As she was cleaning, she felt someone pinch her butt. Living with her fiancé, she laughed and turned, hoping to catch him, only to find no one there. Believing that Keith must have been hiding in the hallway, she started talking to him. "Oh, I wonder who that could have been," she said sarcastically. "You do know I'm busy in here, like you should be too." She returned to cleaning. Again, she felt a pinch on her butt, and she quickly turned only to find no one there. "You think you're so smart, don't you?" she'd asked. "Well, I'll catch you next time." This time she kept cleaning, but bent over far enough that she could see down between her legs. She planned to see him creep around the corner and quickly grab his ankle before he could escape. But when she next felt the sharp pinch, there was no one there. My mother was horrified by this and quickly got up and ran outside. Keith was on a ladder fixing something. When he saw her, he laughed. "Weren't so sneaky this time, were you? You know it's dangerous to tease a man while he's working. I could fall and break my back," he'd said to her. Still scared, she quickly explained what had happened to her, and Keith replied that he'd felt something similar. He kept thinking she was reaching out of the doorway to pinch his butt. When they realized that neither of them had been teasing the other, my mom was very unsettled. But Keith was a country boy with little care for it all. "What, you think it's a ghost or something? Come on, Leanne, it's no big deal," he'd said. My mother finally conceded to ignoring it, but said she was suddenly aware of the house in a way she hadn't been before. She started to record the events that were happening. As time passed, more strange events piled up. In the cold room, there was a dartboard on the wall. Both Keith and my mother noticed that no matter where you left the darts in the room, upon returning, they'd all be in the bullseye. They each thought it was the other one cleaning up, but quickly discovered it wasn't. Keith insisted on ignoring it, but my mother's inquisitive nature wouldn't allow that. While Keith was at work, she looked up things in magazines and books. She said that she read about leaving a notebook and a pencil out might allow ghosts to communicate, so she left a blank notebook and pencil in the cold room. Another feature of the cold room was a walk-in closet. She said that she was trying to find storage for some boxes when she first opened it. There were a lot of old winter clothes hanging and no light inside, making it very dark. My mother reached into the closet, both arms outstretched, looking for the back wall so that she could figure out how many boxes she could fit in. She said she took 3 or 4 steps in, arms fully outstretched, the closet icy cold and the light of the room behind her getting dimmer the farther she went in. She never felt a back wall. My mother suddenly got a bad feeling and quickly left the closet. She closed the door and never tried to enter it again. One last event that occurred in the cold room was when my mother was cleaning. She said it was mid-morning and she was just tidying and checking the notebook. It was blank and it had been long enough without a strange occurrence that she believed maybe it wasn't real after all. When she tried to leave the room, the door refused to open. My mother was locked inside. She banged on the door, jiggled the knob, shoved her shoulder into it, but it wouldn't budge in the slightest. Remember, this is 1991. No cell phones and there was no landline in that room. She was pissed off and annoyed at the old house, but said she wasn't scared. She sat by the window and waited, hoping Keith would come by on his lunch break. He didn't. She waited all day until nearly 5 p.m. when Keith finally returned. When she heard the front door, my mom began banging and yelling, I'm in here," to get his attention. Keith immediately came upstairs and asked what she was doing. "I'm locked inside," she shouted. "The door's locked, and I can't get out." Keith, annoyed with the drama after a long day at work, reminded, "Leanne, there's no lock on this goddamn door." My mother, equally annoyed with having been trapped all day, grabbed the knob to shake it, saying, "It's jammed." But as soon as she twisted the knob, the door opened as easy as anything. They apparently argued that night, my mother angry that Keith refused to believe her, instead blaming the event on a Cali girl not knowing how to shove open a door that stuck. The events up to this point had been creepy little irritations, but nothing truly terrifying. That changed after their 3rd month living there. Keith invited over his brother Daryl and his wife Amy, as well as Amy's friend Jennifer. The 5 of them were all drinking and having a good time. At one point, the 3 women were all in the kitchen discussing music while my mother was cutting up garlic bread. Daryl and Keith had been in the living room together when suddenly, Daryl entered the kitchen. My mother remembers that Amy made a comment about Cher being one of the greatest artists ever, or something when out of nowhere, Daryl became livid. "Why are you talking about that slut? You want to be a whore just like her?" The 3 women were struck silent, confused at the man's temper over such an innocuous statement. According to my mom, Amy even laughed at first. "What the hell? Keep that up and you're on the couch tonight," she'd replied. Daryl was not joking. "You think I don't know what you do behind my back?" He yelled at her and the 3 women all became aware this was deadly serious. "You're a fucking whore, you're a witch," Daryl shouted at her. Distraught, Amy at first tried to reason with him. "What the fuck are you talking about?" She demanded, "What's wrong with you?" Daryl grabbed the knife from the cutting board that my mother had been using, and Amy screamed. He threatened her, and my mother says she doesn't remember everything he was saying at this point, but none of it made sense. While Daryl had Amy cornered in the kitchen, ranting about babies and whores and making her pay, my mother ran to the living room to get Keith for help. He was asleep. Usually Keith is an extremely light sleeper, my mother recounted. Since moving into this house, he'd been plagued by nightmares, and he woke at the slightest noise. Sure, he had been drinking, but not enough for him to pass out. This night, he would not wake. My mother said Daryl was yelling, and Amy was crying, and Jennifer was shouting about calling the cops. My mother was screaming into Keith's face and shaking him, even pulled him off the couch, but he just flopped to the ground, still completely asleep. My mother wasn't in the kitchen to see what happened next, but Jennifer apparently got Daryl's attention long enough for Amy to slip out of the corner and run. Daryl swung the knife after her and cut her arm. The women were crying and running. My mother ran with them into the downstairs bathroom and locked the door. Daryl was screaming at them and banging on the door. "I'll cut the devil right out of you," he shrieked, banging on the door so hard that it shook on its hinges. My mother was a thicker girl, and the window out of the bathroom was very narrow. Jennifer was thin enough to fit through, so while my mother pressed her back to the door to keep it closed, Amy helped Jennifer crawl outside. Jennifer managed to get to a neighbor and call the police. It took them about 10 minutes to arrive, during which my mother said she was terrified and sobbing. At this point, my mom had already been trying to get pregnant and wasn't sure if she was or not, making her even more afraid for her life. She said that Amy tried to speak reason to Daryl, asking why he was doing this, what she did wrong, asking him to please just stop, even apologizing. Daryl was beyond rationality. My mother said what made it so scary was that nothing he was saying even made sense. It seemed disjointed. Threats about hellfire and accusations of cheating that were not in Daryl's character at all. He certainly wasn't the perfect husband. There had been some domestic disputes in the past, but nothing on the level of death threats. When the police arrived, they disarmed and arrested Daryl. There is an actual record of this, and my mother gave a statement about the event. She also said that as soon as Daryl stepped outside, within seconds, Keith woke up. He was groggy and asked what the hell happened. He was also questioned by the police but had witnessed nothing. They assumed because of the alcohol that he'd passed out, but my mother knew better. My mother told me that after a few hours of holding, Daryl calmed down. The couple and their friend refused to ever return to that house. My mother said she asked Keith about his brother a few times, but that he didn't want to talk about it. She says she doesn't think Amy pressed charges, and she's not sure if Daryl went to jail over the whole thing. She did say she once tried to call Amy only to have the other woman hang up on her. In their fourth and final month of stay at this house, Keith was working incessantly on trying to get the crawl space door open. It was almost like a pet project of his. One Saturday, he woke early and began working on prying it open. He worked well into the afternoon, at which point my mother went to stop him. She told him to give up on the damn thing, that he was going to injure himself and he needed to take a break. Keith agreed to take a break at least and stood with her to go downstairs for lunch. My mother said that as soon as they were halfway down the stairs, they heard a loud creak. They each froze before slowly turning around to find the crawl space door had swung open. Having dealt with nightmares and all these strange, unexplainable events, my mother was instantly on guard. Keith, too, was far more wary of the house and had no longer been trying to convince my mom it wasn't real, but he hadn't quite begun to believe her either. My mom said that in his generation, it just wasn't done to speak aloud about those types of concerns. "I guess I finally loosened it," Keith said, and my mother did a double take. "Are you fucking kidding me?" she'd asked. "That thing opened while we're all the way over here. Just close it." "I've been trying to get into this thing for months, Leanne," Keith argued. "I'm going to see what's in it. We need the space." "No, we don't," my mother retorted, but she was ignored. Keith approached the door, crouching down to go inside, and my mother, though scared, couldn't abandon her fiancé. She walked over and stood by his side. As Keith slowly tried to crawl inside, my mother grabbed his shoulder and stopped him. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" she asked. "Well, how else am I going to reach inside?" Keith replied. Shining a flashlight from his toolbox, Keith described seeing a bunch of boxes and old shit. He said he couldn't see the back wall and wondered aloud how big the space actually was. He wanted to crawl in further, but my mother protested so loudly that he finally gave up on the notion and shut the door. This door was right at the top of the stairs, and now that it had been opened once, my mother said that it was frequently open. They would close it each time, but then, when they tried to go upstairs, would see the open door and the darkness of the crawl space beyond. One day, after the plywood fell from the wall upstairs again, my mom decided to move the notebook in there. She still wasn't sure if she believed in ghosts, but she wanted some kind of proof. She pinned the notebook inside along with a pen on a string. She also decided to leave a quarter in a chalk circle, another tip from a book. A few days later, my mother said she was preparing dinner, and Keith came into the kitchen to help. They'd been chatting and making jokes until Keith started chopping vegetables. My mother made a comment, something about a lady on the news, she thinks, when suddenly Keith said, "Why are you talking about that slut? You want to be a whore like her?" My mom said she got chills immediately, and when she looked over, realized that Keith was using the exact same knife that Daryl had threatened Amy with. Remember, Keith was asleep during that fight and had never heard his brother say those words. She told him she'd forgotten something from the store, grabbed the keys, and ran. She didn't return until the next morning, choosing to stay over at a friend's house. She said nothing happened that night, but hearing those words had frightened her to the core. When she asked Keith about it later, he claimed he didn't remember saying it and was only upset that she'd left in such a hurry. They planned to move, unable to stand the nightmares and uncanny happenings at the house any longer. However, they had to wait until the end of the month. When they had only 1 week left, they were sitting together watching a movie late into the evening when they heard the plywood upstairs fall out of the wall. Keith went to replace it, and my mother went with him, unwilling to sit alone downstairs and wait. Knowing that they'd soon be moving out, Keith actually peeked his head inside the wall, commenting, "I wonder how far this actually goes back." My mother insisted that he not go in, claiming it gave her a sick feeling to even look at the darkness inside the wall. She said it was unnaturally dark. They shone a flashlight in and couldn't see an end of the room, no other end of the wall. In fact, the floor didn't continue all the way inside, but they couldn't see down to the bottom downstairs. It looked like unending darkness. This was the first time either of them had really explored the area. My mother saw that the notebook she'd tacked up, as well as the pen, were lying on the floor, the paper torn, and the quarter was moved from its chalk circle. She began to freak out, demanding they leave right then. That was plenty enough proof for her, and she didn't want to sleep in this house one more night. Keith didn't understand her fear, scolding her for buying into the paranormal bullshit and using a notebook and pen to communicate. My mom argued that the wall was unnatural. With the layout of the house, this wall should have led only straight to the outside. There simply shouldn't have been enough space to create the kind of darkness. Keith insisted it was fine. To prove it, he picked up the quarter, throwing it to hear it hit the bottom. The quarter disappeared into the darkness. It was freezing cold, a draft coming from someplace they couldn't see. My mom and Keith stood there for over a minute before he finally realized they weren't going to hear it hit anything. At that point, even if they did, it would have been too far to be anything other than supernatural. They were both so unsettled that they replaced the plywood and left immediately. They stayed in a hotel for the remainder of the week, returning to pack up their things during daylight. When they'd returned, the plywood was displaced again. When turning in their keys, the owner of the property said that Keith and my mother stayed there longer than anyone else who had rented the house in recent memory. Not only that, but that the people who'd left before them had had some kind of domestic dispute involving a knife and accusations of adultery. My mother researched the property and found that it had been on Native American land, though that wasn't uncommon for the area. She couldn't find any record of crime that occurred there, though she believes the events with the knives were too unlikely to be mere coincidence. She later divorced Keith and moved back to California. I'd like to remind that this story is absolutely real. It may not have any jump scares or gore, but it is a description of a real haunting. More stories from family members coming soon. The next one is from my grandmother. I know my first story was long and had a lot of common signs of haunting. This story is entirely different. My grandmother told me this in confidence, so I've left her unnamed and changed the names of the other person involved. Let me preface this with a little background about my grandmother. She was a tough black girl who lived in Alabama during the civil rights movement. She's about the strongest woman I know. I've never seen her cry. She once worked in a steel mill and she made her own hammer, steel handle and all, with her name engraved into the side. She sleeps with it under her pillow. For as long as I've known her, she's had weapons in every room and a plan for a break-in through every entrance in her home. When she was in her mid-20s, she was with an abusive husband. She took her 5 kids one night, closed her eyes, and picked a place on a map to disappear to. That's how my family ended up where we are in California. Too proud for welfare, she worked every day of her life. After moving to an entirely new area, she started working as a janitor at a nearby university, an hour commute from the home she could afford. Over decades, she worked her way up, always sharp for job openings and advancement. At the time of this story, she was working in the financial aid department. Now, she certainly wasn't rich, and though she worked, she couldn't afford her own car. She either took the bus or carpooled with her coworkers. For more than 30 years, she rode on a dark highway at 4 a.m. to reach her job on time. One day, she was carpooling with her good friend Lisa. I don't know much about Lisa, as I never met her. On this particular early morning, sometime in autumn, my grandmother was driving the car so that Lisa could get a little bit of extra sleep. They frequently did this, so my grandmother was familiar with driving this road in this car. It was very dark, the sky thick with fog obscuring the stars. While my grandmother doesn't remember exactly, she believed it must have been the new moon because of how dark it was. They'd been driving for a while without seeing another car, either in front or behind them. The area we live in is very hilly, and as they began descending the first big hill, my grandmother saw a single light on the top of the hill behind them. She thought it must have been a motorcycle and didn't really consider it strange at first. Yet as they continued driving, the light didn't move. It stayed at the top of the hill but never seemed to get any smaller. It was bright white and far more luminescent than a single headlight should be. At this point, my grandmother turned to Lisa and asked, "Do you see that light behind us?" Lisa turned around in her seat and looked out the back windshield. "Yeah," she'd replied. "It's just sitting there. That's dangerous. This is the highway." "Yeah, it is strange," my grandmother said absently, deciding to just keep driving and get to their destination. They were approximately 2 or 3 miles away from the light at this point, when suddenly the light zoomed forward. That's the best way my grandmother could describe it. In less than a second, the light went from being at the top of the hill to just a couple of car lengths behind them, the bright white lighting the cabin of their car. Lisa screamed, "Shit, shit, hit the gas, hit the gas." "What is that?" my grandmother yelled, pressing the pedal to the floor and making their medium little sedan rocket as fast as it could down the darkened highway. "I don't know," Lisa replied, turned fully in her seat to examine it. "Is it a motorcycle?" my grandma asked. But Lisa only shook her head. "I can't see, it's too bright," the other woman said. My grandmother continued to speed down the highway, her headlights barely cutting through the dark and fog, while the light behind them shone like a beacon. They started to outpace it, and after a few minutes, they turned around a bend and it seemed they'd finally lost it. Relieved, they each let out nervous laughter and discussed what they thought they'd seen, trying to figure out if it had been some kind of racer or something else. Just like any other friends that see something strange on the road together, but back before they could post on Facebook about it or something. For a few more minutes, they were finally safe, ready for this to just be a strange thing they'd tell their coworkers about later. But again, in only a split second, the road behind them was lit up white. Lisa started screaming and hitting my grandmother's shoulder. What? My grandmother asked. "What is it?" It's back! Holy shit, what is that thing?" My grandmother said that all of her mirrors showed nothing but a bright white glare, but there was no sound at all. She couldn't hear another engine or see the outline of a car. In fact, the light was much bigger than it could have possibly been, maybe the size of a car all itself. This time, it did not stay car lengths away. It came right up against the car, so close I almost seemed it was pressing on the trunk. My grandmother said that at this point, she was screaming as well and worried that they might crash. "I'm going to see what it is," Lisa said suddenly, rolling down her window. "Keep us on the road." "Are you crazy?" my grandma asked. "I have to see it," Lisa insisted. "It's chasing us. I have to know what it is." The light kept getting closer, to the point that my grandmother said it was hard to even see anything. The light filled up her entire back window. Then it slowly crawled up higher and higher. "Shit, it's on top of the car!" my grandmother shouted. She said she'd never been more scared in her life, and not because she was certain she would die. Instead, she was scared because she had no clue what was happening. She said it was such a break from any kind of normality or reality that she was terrified to the quick of her soul. "I can almost see it," Lisa said, leaning her head out of the window. My grandmother was driving fast, and the cold early morning air whipped through the cabin, chilling them both. My grandmother said she smelled something like rotten eggs or sulfur, but there was still no sound. The road was still empty, no other cars in sight, and no sound except their own struggling engine. "What is it?" my grandmother asked. "What the hell is it? Can we get it off?" The light was on the roof of the car, but it shone down into her side mirrors, so she knew it was still there. I can almost, Lisa started to say before she shouted, "Oh God, oh God." "Lisa, what? What is it?" my grandmother kept asking. "Oh, holy Jesus, oh Christ, no, no, no." Lisa cried out, tears on her cheeks from either the intense emotion or the cold air hitting her eyes. Lisa leaned back into the car, her whole body shaking as she hurriedly rolled up the window again. My grandmother said the light stopped. It just stopped accelerating with them and hovered above the highway behind them. She was too scared to stop driving, but she saw it for a split second in the rearview mirror before it seemed to just zoom away again, faster than she could follow. Then the highway was empty. Lisa was shaking her head and sobbing, muttering the Lord's Prayer as they were both Catholic. My grandmother continued to try and ask Lisa what she saw, but the woman refused to answer. My grandmother described Lisa as friendly, assertive, reliable, and devout. She said the worst the woman could be was a little dim at times, but she'd never been weak-spirited or prone to dramatics. Lisa curled herself down into the footwell of the passenger seat, nearly in the fetal position, and cried for the rest of the drive, mumbling half-remembered prayers and things like, "No God, no, please no." The highway they were on eventually merges with a freeway that takes them to the university. Here they finally saw other cars. My grandmother said she cried in relief as she finally saw the sky lighten with sunrise when they neared the university. She said that she was still wiping tears from her face once they parked. She had to bodily drag Lisa out of the passenger seat, and it took the other woman more than 20 minutes to recover. Even then, she appeared to be shell-shocked. My grandmother went to work with her a few more times after this event, but each time she tried to discuss what Lisa had seen, the other woman refused to talk. At first, she would either change the subject or remain quiet. But after a day or so, Lisa would reply by saying, "What are you talking about? That's crazy. I didn't see anything. Did we even drive together that day? I don't know what you're talking about." Their friendship suffered so greatly that within weeks they stopped talking altogether, and my grandma found a new carpool group. At the end of the story, I asked my grandma what she thought the light was, and she said she had no idea, but she knew it wasn't of this world. She didn't say whether she believed it was a spirit or an alien, or just a glitch in the Matrix. We live near an Air Force base, and my grandmother has even once had a friend that worked at Area 51 for a short period of time. She told me that she'd once asked her friend if he believed in aliens. He took a deep breath and more than 20 seconds to reply, "I don't know if aliens exist, but I'll tell you, I've seen some things that I cannot explain." That's as much as I can say on the topic. Of course, just because he worked there doesn't mean that he knew all of the secrets or that he has a reliable opinion. My grandmother maintains that this was the scariest and strangest thing that ever happened to her. To my knowledge, she has only told this story a handful of times in more than 2 decades, and only ever to a small group of family members. I know that it's a cliche on R or no sleep, but I'd like to remind that these stories actually are real. I know some might not consider them particularly exciting, nor do they really have a set plot or an overarching message. They're just real accounts from my family members. That doesn't mean I really know what causes these sort of experiences or that I can guarantee there wasn't any bias or mind tricks at work. But I can guarantee that I'm only using what I find to be the most genuine and well-corroborated stories. This next story is actually a mixture of accounts from many different people in my family, including me. That's because most of us old enough to remember had visited this particular house. My great-aunt Rose, as in my grandmother's sister, was the youngest of 9 children. She was coddled and spoiled, but she was a sweet and imaginative girl. Like some of her other siblings, she did express having some strange abilities. Particularly, Rose always had imaginary friends. Always. As she grew older, she stopped talking about them as often. Her parents were the most lenient with her, but she still understood that certain things were not to be discussed. Devoutly Catholic, it was simply not done to discuss demons or spirits. Back then, especially in the South, she said you could still be accused of playing with magic or voodoo. During the time of this story, Rose was firmly convinced of the out of sight, out of mind, out of existence approach, though she later admitted to considering herself something of a medium. She was careful to keep it discreet, but as an adult, she no longer made her interest in the occult a secret. In fact, she's really the one who started our family tradition of celebrating Halloween together. She said she's not proud of it, and she's certainly never attempted to profit off of it. But she gained something of a reputation among her closest friends and our family as having the kind of hunches you don't ignore. As a young teen, I remember many times seeing her stare into a corner and asking, "What's wrong with Auntie Rosie?" Only to have my questions rebuffed. I remember times in which Rose would turn to a specific family member and say, "You need to go outside, right now, or you're not allowed to drive home," even if they hadn't been drinking. I used to think it was strange that my otherwise rational and intelligent family members, even my own mother, would listen when Rose said something like that. As for the main story, Rose also moved from Alabama to California. In fact, all of my grandmother's siblings did, for better work and opportunity. Rose had 3 children from her first husband before he died, and then 2 children with her second husband. They lived in this particular house for about 2 years, and approx ages are listed for the time. Her eldest son, Jared, 22, had already moved out and had a son of his own at quite a young age. Due to some tumultuous issues, never made clear to me as I was too young to know, Rose took in her grandson, Mark, 5. Her 4 children by descending age were Elise, 15, 17, Caleb, 14, 16, Maggie, 10, 12, and Talia, 8, 10. These names are changed, but their real names are actually a bit strange. She named her girls after famous witches. I'm not kidding, my cousins are named after witches, some from the Salem trials. They also each have about 5 middle names, but I digress. Our family was very close back in the day, and I remember visits to their home. However, I was quite young, about 4, 6 years old, so my few memories are foggy. I do remember the house was spooky. It made me a little uncomfortable, but I was always there with family and never felt unsafe. I used to think it looked like it was alive. It was one of those homes where it feels as though the windows are eyes watching you and the doorway is a mouth. In retrospect, it was kind of a crappy place. It was brown, weathered so badly that as a child I thought it was unpainted. It was a bit ramshackle, but sturdy where it mattered. This house was very haunted, according to all residents that lived there and all family old enough to have visited and remembered. This is a record of some of the events that occurred there. The home had only 3 bedrooms, 2 smaller rooms upstairs, and a master room downstairs. Rose and Frank had the master room, of course, and at first the children split the rooms upstairs. Elise, Maggie, and Talia all shared a room, while Caleb had a room to himself. However, this did not last long. Caleb said he had terrible nightmares and felt extremely uncomfortable upstairs. He said he felt constantly on edge to the point that he began losing weight and sleep and even some of his hair. He hated his room, and within a month of moving in, he began sleeping in the den so regularly it became his unofficial room. He was not the only one to feel this way. In fact, every male member of my family expressed extreme discomfort with being upstairs. Frank would go up only when absolutely necessary and only in the daylight. All of my cousins and uncles, even friends that were invited over, all felt the exact same thing. They felt as though they were somewhere that they shouldn't be. At first, little Mark felt perfectly fine there. He would sleep either in Caleb's abandoned room or between his aunts to watch VHS films on their tiny TV. When he turned 5 years old, this stopped. He too was suddenly plagued with nightmares, claimed, "The ladies don't want me here." He cried whenever he was left to sleep there and began only sleeping in the den with Caleb. This was so common that I and my other cousins were told, "Boys aren't allowed upstairs." When I asked why, ever the inquisitive child, I was simply told it was because. Just yesterday, as we all discussed these old stories, my male cousins said a few of them had even become physically ill after staying up there for any extended period of time. They said it was always worse at nighttime. Looking into the history of the home, there was little to find except rumor. My town was big on prohibition back in the day. In fact, there's a huge mural downtown depicting ladies literally tying ropes to the beams of the old bar and pulling it down. Local histories say that some of the older houses became secret bars, almost like a speakeasy. And while there was no concrete documentation of it, Rose said she had heard enough about the house to believe that's what it was. While boys weren't allowed upstairs, girls felt very uncomfortable in the den. My cousin Talia once described it like this. She was going down there for something, she didn't remember what. But when she turned on the light, she had the exact same sensation as walking into a room and having everyone turn to stare at you. She said it made her skin crawl and she refused to go in there alone. At night, all 3 girls sleeping upstairs would hear the screen door slamming open and shut. They could hear what sounded like men talking. At first they thought their father was inviting over friends and smoking or something. The den and dining room did smell strongly of cigar smoke in the mornings. Yet, when asked, Frank and Rose didn't know what they were talking about. Although their room on the first floor was closer to the back door, they heard nothing at all. I remember as a child playing in the front yard and seeing people I didn't recognize in the windows upstairs. But my family was big. If you couldn't tell, my grandma one of 9, my own mother one of 5, and slew of cousins I grew up beside. So I wasn't very bothered by seeing people I didn't recognize. When I asked about this, Elise, the eldest of the girls, would tell me to shut up and not to look in the windows. 2 of my cousins, not Rose's children, and I all remembered one particular event. We were playing in the front yard and we kept seeing someone poke their head over the gate leading to the backyard. At first I thought it must have been my uncle trying to trick us, but I remember having the intense sensation of both knowing the person and having never seen them before. All 3 of us described the face of the person as dark and indiscernible. Both of my cousins were about 2 years older than me and had a better sense of self-preservation. The eldest of us 3 said he remembered looking at it and knowing it wanted us. He remembered knowing we had to get away. I wanted to go to the gate and peek through the slats to see who it was, but my older cousins refused, pulling me by the arms to keep me in the front yard. I cried and complained, but they refused to tell me why we couldn't go there, only that we couldn't. Indignant, I went to tell the adults about this, but when I explained what we'd seen, they became quiet. Frank went into the backyard briefly to check that it was empty, but the adults refused to say a word further on the topic. My cousins and I left soon after. We usually went to Rose's for large family events, as the living room and dining room were very big. My mother and her sisters all recounted tales of having someone whisper in their ear, only to turn and find no one there. They recounted stories of TVs turning on by themselves and phantom footsteps down hallways. There was one spot on the stairs that always smelled of old-fashioned perfume, something like lavender. Everyone who had ever been there smelled it. It was so common, in fact, that the 3 girls said they'd been asked about it countless times by friends who came over. There was one event for which I was present but don't recall, where everyone, at least 15 people, was in the dining room eating dinner and chatting when the room suddenly plummeted in temperature so sharply that everyone went quiet. For a minute or so, they'd sat there until Rose calmly stood up with her plate and went to the back porch. Everyone else followed suit soon after and tried to continue as though nothing had happened. While I loved spending time with my Auntie Rosie, as she always had something fun to do and something sweet to eat, my mother was loath to ever leave me there. The only time she allowed Rose to babysit me was once when she had no choice. Other than that, I only visited the house while my mother was there with me. Elise especially had a very hard time living in this house. She hated the occult and the creepy things happening there. She hated that her parents only ignored it and wouldn't discuss things she'd seen or felt. She was the daughter of Rose's first marriage and felt somewhat of a disconnect from Maggie and Talia, who were in reality only her half-sisters. Elise was disturbed to find Talia having full conversations with imaginary friends at 10 years old. She was annoyed with Maggie's constant reading creepy books and watching scary movies. At 17, she was already well into the I hate my life stage of her teenage years, and living in that house didn't help. Elise is actually a bit estranged from the family now, and she won't be coming to our Halloween party. Maggie and Talia admitted that Elise was always a bit of a sensitive soul for all that she acted the tough girl. They said she suffered the most in that house. Rose believes that of all her children, Elise inherited her gift the strongest. Maggie and Talia say that Elise would sometimes admit to seeing people standing in the corners, that she sometimes heard them talking to her. When I was 13, I remember one family event where Elise suddenly dropped everything in a hurry and ran outside. The room quieted in shock until Rose said, "It's all right. There's just a little girl passing through. Elise doesn't like her." Rose said many years ago that one of her biggest regrets was a conversation she had with Elise. Elise was distraught and terrified at the end of her rope with the stress. But Rose brushed her concerns aside, instead only telling her to stay strong and ignore it, to simply pray. According to Rose, this was before she'd come to accept her own strange abilities, and she'd wrongly pushed her own denial onto her daughter. The last straw, the event that made my Aunt Rose and Uncle Frank move out of that house, was this. The 4 kids were all going upstairs together. They planned to move some boxes of VHS tapes and blankets down to the living room to hang out together. Caleb only went halfway up the stairs, planning for the girls to only pass him things. They would never make it all the way upstairs. Elise was leading the way, Maggie behind her, Talia next, Caleb last. They had been joking, and Elise turned back to look down at her siblings and make some kind of witty retort. She suddenly felt a hot breath on the nape of her neck and a creeping hand slide up her shoulder. Elise froze solid. Her siblings looked up at her, and their faces drained of color, eyes going wide, all of them paralyzed in terror as well. Elise turned slowly and saw an impossibly large figure of pure black. They said it had no discernible facial features or clothing, and described it as a shadow man. It was just the outline of a human shape, almost like a shadow, but in 3 dimensions and pitch black, darker than any shadow could be. They could not see through it. Elise screamed, and that made her siblings scream as well. They all began running. They didn't stop until they were half a block away. All 4 of them saw it. Elise said she'd seen things like that before, but it was a first for the other 3, and they were all so utterly horrified they refused to live there any longer. While they waited to find a new place, Maggie, Talia, and Caleb slept together in the living room. Elise never again stepped foot inside the house. She was old enough that she couch surfed for a bit until her parents could find a new place. My Aunt Rose has since had a stroke, and while I don't know if she's ever lost her ability, her health makes it difficult to communicate about it. That house was actually demolished over a decade ago, about 4 years after my family members moved out of it. More stories from my family coming soon. Especially with Halloween approaching, we've been discussing it more and more. I think next time, I'll share what happened to me directly that made me question my atheism and accept that science cannot explain everything.